So, and then they want to build everything else off of the major. So we're going to say that's going to be our baseline, is going to be the C major. Now, I would think it would be better to call it by mode, because once I get to the other modes, like in particular the Dorian and the Mixolydian, the system kind of falls apart, right? And the naming conventions get really wonky, and they don't give you context within the song. So I would think it would be better to call it by mode. So I would think the default would be C, and it would be the Ionian. I would call it an IC2, naming it in a modal construction. Now you might say, hey, look, no one does that. How can I communicate with anyone else? Well, you can still convert it easily enough. Even like if you learn this, you can put it into ChatGTP or something to do the conversion, because it's all logical. But I really think if you name the chords you're playing by the mode, that's going to be a lot easier for you to contextually see where you are on the fretboard. And that's the point of like tablature. That's the point of chords, right? What you had is sheet music, which was like multiple instruments playing in an orchestra before, right? They were all playing in an orchestra, and they're all playing like melodies, but you put the melodies all together and whatnot. So maybe the chord construction is not quite as important, but if you're playing on a guitar or a piano, chords and tablature becomes more important. We need a way to jot it down. And this is the system they kind of came up with, but it's not the most efficient system. It would be easier to jot down, hey, look, I'm on the 1, the 4, the 5, and to see them differently, to see them as modal chords, because that tells you where you are in the context of both the song and the fretboard. This will become more apparent once we get through the Ionian and we get to like the Lydian and the Mixolydian. All right, if I say IC2, why do I call it a C2? It's an Ionian, it's a C chord, and the 2 means that I'm going to be measuring distance. That's going to be what I call 2 modal whole steps, meaning I don't need to say the scale degree. I want to measure it in distance. So if you're on the Ionian, I'm going to call it a modal whole step, which is you skip one, and then another modal whole step, you skip one. So you're on this node, and then there's 2 modal whole steps. So that's why I'm going to call it an IC2 chord, which is a 3-note Ionian C chord. It's a 3-note Ionian C chord. All right. If it was the tonic, I can capitalize the I. See how that can give me more context within the song and say, hey, look, this is the tonal center of the song, which I'm showing with the fact that I have a capital I instead of a lowercase I. You don't have to use that, but I think that would give you a little bit, see how that gives you more context within the song, which is the whole point of jotting the stuff down. Okay, so then what would this be in terms of the modal half steps? So I would call this distance terms. So this would be similar to the scale degrees. So what I'm going to say is I would rather from like if you were to build the system today, I don't want to rename this as the 1. It happens to be the 1, but I'd rather just call that node. I'm on the Ionian node, and I'm going to say that's 0, and then I'm going to go up 2 modal half steps, which is 1 modal whole step, and another 2 modal half steps, which is 1 modal whole step. So I'm going to have the node we're on plus 2 modal half steps plus 2 modal half steps, right? If I convert that to the scale degrees, what does that do? From a scale degrees standpoint, the Ionian would be the 1, and then I would go up 2 modal whole half steps and up 2 modal half steps. So from my perspective, from a programming perspective, from just a systems perspective, the scale degree system is off by 1 because they started counting from the node they were on as the 1 instead of counting from the node we're on as you typically measure things. When you measure things, you don't count the thing that you're on, you measure from the thing that you're on. So from a systems perspective, the current thing that we're using is off by 1 because of that error. So it would be better it'd be better to say, look, it's distance-wise 0 to 4. And that converts to the scale degrees, which would all be off by 1 of the 1, 3, 5. So in other words, when we look at this chord, we would say they're going to make this the 1 from a scale degree standpoint and say it's the Ionian, the Phrygian, and the Mixolydian. They're going to say C, E, and G, but I would rather say Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, because that works in any key, right? And so I'd rather say, well, this is the node we're on, 0 plus 2 plus another 2, 0, 2, 4. right? Instead of one, right? So if you learn it that way, you'll actually learn what distance means. These are supposed to be distance terms that they turned into scale degree terms, but they should be distance terms. Okay. So that's an easy conversion is what I'm trying to say here. So then what if I notice I can name the chord by nodes? Nobody does this, but they should, because this, especially on the guitar, because if you name the points, you could say it's the 0, 2, 4 or the 1, 3, 5 scale degrees, but if you're it would be better to name than naming by notes to name by nodes. Instead of telling the notes that are in there, you say the continent names that are in there, right? You have, if you're starting on the Ionian is the 1 in our Nashville music system. So if I start on the 1 and then I go up 2 modal whole steps, I get to the 3, 2 modal whole steps, I get to the 5. So from a Nashville number system, I could still call it a 1, 3, 5, but that just happens to be because the Ionian has the 1. It'll be different once we get to the other modes. So I'm going to say, what are the nodes in it? What continents do I have to hold down with my finger? I have to hold down the Ionian, the Phrygian, the Mixolydian, right? I have to hold down here the Ionian, the Phrygian, and the Mixolydian, right? And it would be a bar chord. You can see it this way, bar chord, and here, right? And that's what you got to hold down. And you might say, well, why don't you say you got to hold down, a C, a G, and an E? Because if you moved this whole thing up to a C sharp, you'd still be holding down an Ionian, Mixolydian, and a Phrygian, a 1, 3, 5 node standpoint. Whereas the notes will be different. Now the 1, 3, 5 happens to line up to the scale degrees. That's only because we're on the Ionian though. It'll be different once we get to the next one. All right. So what if we said we want to build a 4-note chord? What would that be called traditionally? It would be a C major 7. What does that mean? We'll get into these normal naming conventions later and scale degrees later. I just want to list it out for now. C major 7. So now we're listing that it's going to be a major versus a minor, and we have to do that because if we just say C7, it'll be something different. And then we're going to have to say that it's a 7, which lists the scale degree. So meaning if we make the Ionian the 1, it would be the last note, the 7th of it. So it would be a major 7th. So that means that if I'm on the Ionian, from just skipping every other note, we would say, well, we would have an Ionian, a Phrygian, a Mixolydian, and then a Locrian would be the general idea, right? Let me see if I can use the pens up here. We have an Ionian, a Lydian, wait, no, hold on. No, I'm not used to using these pens. Let me do this again. A Mixolydian, and then a Locrian. So that would be the 1, that would be the 3, and then the 5, and then the 7. The 7 is the last one in a scale degree type of system. Now, I think it would be easier to say, it'd be more simple to say, hey, look, we're just doing a C3 chord or an Ionian, an IC3 chord. But you said it was a 4-note chord. It is a 4-note chord because the 3 represents distance from the node we are on, which happens to be the 1 right now because 1 is the Ionian mode, but I don't need to change it if it wasn't the Ionian mode. So I don't need to list the scale degree. I just need to say, hey, look, you just take every other note from that nodal point, right? It's the same thing. So instead of listing it by the scale degree, we just list how many modal whole steps, distance terms, you need to take from the node that you're on. You're just going around the block. That's an easier way to visualize it, and it's easier to figure out on the fretboard because you can figure it out by skipping every other note. Remember, to build these on the fretboard, we usually see them by either shape, and then we can also build them by taking every other note within the scale here, kind of like by formula. And then we can also build them by intervals, which we'll talk more about later. Right now, we're doing the most intuitive way, which is just taking every other note as we go around the block of the 7 nodes. Now, if it was the modal center, we can call it an IC3 and make it a capital. All right, so what would be the modal half steps? So if we start on that node, I'm not going to call it the 1. Because it happens to be node 1 as the Ionian. But if it wasn't node 1, I'm still just going to call it, that's the node we're on. I'm measuring from that point. It is starting at 0, not 1. That's what a computer programmer, an engineer would do, because it's the simplest thing to do, because you're doing measurement. And then you're going to go up 2 modal half steps or 1 modal whole step to get to the next note, up another 2 modal half steps or 1 modal whole step to get to the next note, and up a 2 modal half steps or 1 modal whole step to get to the next note. Note, either convention assumes that we're going to start with a baseline triad and all of the modal half steps before the one that we are on are included. So as we go up the scale degrees or go up modal whole steps, we assume that all other notes are included. Now, we could drop some of those other notes in theory, and later, if we have a cleaner system, it will be easier for us to list which of those other notes we want to drop, which is harder to do if your system isn't clean, because then the chord conventions get too complex. So we want the chords to be as clean as possible so that then I can do more complex things to them. Like, say I want to play in a different octave. I have a spread chord, the third is an octave up or something like that. We'll talk more about that later. But if you have a clean chord consistent system that you understand as cleanly as possible, then you can do those things. Now, if we saw this by scale degrees, all these would be off by 1. We're going to say we start on the 1 now from the scale degree and then go up 2 modal whole steps, 2 modal whole steps, 2 modal whole steps. So normally people will call this a 1, 3, 5, 7. But what we would like to do is I happen to be on node number 1, but if I weren't on node number 1, as we'll do shortly on like the Mixolydian, I don't want to make it the 1, right? So I can easily convert this to a distance terminology by just saying all of those should be down by 1. I should be on the node we're on, and then the 2, 4, 6. And so we can call those the modal half steps, right? From a modal half steps point of view, it's the 2, 4, 6. From a scale degree standpoint, therefore, it's the 0, 2, 4, 6. From a scale degree standpoint, therefore, it's the 1, 3, 5, 7, right? 1, 3, 5, 7 includes the node that we're on, which from a programming standpoint is an error. So what are the modes that are in it? Well, if we start on mode number 1, because the Ionian is mode number 1, we would be holding down the Ionian, the Phrygian, the Mixolydian, and then we have to hold down the Locrian.